Good evening, my holy sisters and brothers. That was Shlomo Carlebach singing Ki Va Moed from the When Do We Eat soundtrack. When Do We Eat, the movie that Nina and I wrote and I directed. It's just such an awesome version of the song. It basically means, the time has come, Lord, arise and be among us. Bring in the world to come in this world, the Messianic age, etc. We've had tough times. It's time to break on through, to that glorious new world that awaits us. I am super excited about today's class. I'm going to be sharing a bit of Torah from John Steinbeck concerning specifically how the Hebrew of the Torah has been translated and mistranslated into English in such a way that it's not just like the grammar was a little bit off or the translation was a little bit off, but that the meaning of the original text has really been changed, and how careful you need to be when you read the Bible to understand exactly what God was saying to us. It's a lesson that struck me long before I reconnected with Judaism, when I was just kind of out there, when I was an English major in college, and I read the book East of Eden by John Steinbeck. And I don't even really remember the story of that novel, but I remember being struck by this particular passage, and it has a direct connection to the page of Talmud that we're going to be studying today, and that's why I'm bringing it up. We're actually going to start with that bit of Torah, but first, let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we get it going on a Wednesday evening? Pauline in Arkansas, Yehudit in South Carolina, Renee in Bloomington, James in Indianapolis, Paul in Chicago, Melissa in Great Neck, Carolyn in Raleigh, Stephen in New Hampshire, Nancy in North Carolina, Belle in Illinois with her dogs, Lucy in Minnesota, John in Sedona, Ann in Merced, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, PK in Colorado, Donatella says shalom, Francisco in Placerville, Michael says shalom, another Michael is in Dallas, Aaron in Kansas City, and it skipped down on me. Very good. Yeah, more dancing. Francisco likes that Kiva Moed. Patrice in Utah. Steve in Tallahassee. Over there on the YouTube side, Seraphim in Sacramento. And Gigi says shalom. Welcome, welcome, everybody. So, in this novel, East of Eden, and as I recall, the basic plot is that you had a multi-generational family in California. Maybe I felt the call of California even so many, a decade before I came out here. But I remember it's a multi-generational family in the Central Valley of California, perhaps Salinas, perhaps. And there's problems in that family. There's problems. There's real serious, perhaps evil, or at least misdoings, bad acts done in this family. And now there's two sons, which are the new generation. And as I recall, one of the sons is just so emotionally caught up in this idea that he's fated to become as bad as the members of his family. I don't remember the plot very well. But what I remember is, he's very upset about this. He sees his own misbehavior, and he just kind of sees himself as doomed to replicate the misdeeds of his, of the previous generation and the generation before that. And one of the characters in the novel, in East of Eden by John Steinbeck, looks at a verse, Genesis 4:7, and that's going to figure prominently in today's daf, today's page of the Talmud, and how this verse contains an ambiguity that our sages state it's an ambiguity ensconced in the Torah. Right? Like, we cannot know exactly what the Torah meant. And this is because, we're used to English, which has sentences that begin with a capital letter and end with a period. No such thing in the Torah. There's no capital letters and small letters. All the letters are in one case, as it were. And there's no punctuation. Much, much later than the Torah was given, more than 2,000 years after the Torah was given, the Masoretes sort of came up with an established and accepted version that would have the vowelization and the punctuation and the trope for when we chant the Torah. This has been established for about 1,000 years, which in our history is pretty recent. But as the Torah itself was given, it just goes one word to the next, one word to the next. And to really be sure what it means is not always so easy. And so the sages are going to pick out, they could basically figure out what every verse means, except for in 5 places in the Torah. One of those places is verse 4:7, Genesis chapter 4, verse 7. Now, interestingly, the ambiguity that our sages point out in today's page of Talmud is not the ambiguity that John Steinbeck focused on in his novel. Okay, so let me read it to you. Let me just read this passage the way it is in the novel. I saw the quote before. So John Steinbeck focuses, I saw this before. Do we have the passage? Yeah. So he focuses on this word timshel, which occurs at the end of the verse. So let me read you the verse, chapter 4, verse 7, the way it's written in the Chabad online version of the Torah, chapter 4, verse 7. And this is the episode when Cain and Abel, who are the first humans that are born. They're the first humans like us that are born of a mom, right? Adam and Eve were made by God. They weren't born. Cain and Abel were the first humans that were born, the first to have an experience somewhat like ours. As they grew up, Cain became a farmer. He tended to be a farmer and who would bring beautiful crops out of the ground. And Abel was a shepherd. And a moment came when they wanted to give a gift to God, an offering of thanksgiving to God. Abel chose a lamb or a sheep, the best of the flock. He brought a firstborn of his flocks and of their fattest. Right, so he brought the best of the flock, whether it was a goat or a sheep, it doesn't even say. And he made an offering, an animal offering from the best of what he could give. And Cain brought the fruit of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And maybe he didn't choose the choicest. It just says a fruit of the soil, right? And maybe he's a farmer, maybe it's some wheat, right? Already Adam and Eve, when they've been kicked out of the Garden of Eden, had been told by the sweat of your brow you shall eat. So they're farming. And Cain brings an offering from the ground, and Abel brings from the flock. And what happens? And Abel too brought a firstborn of his flocks and of their fattest, and the Lord turned to Abel and to his offering. Verse 5, but to Cain and to his offering he did not turn, and it annoyed Cain exceedingly, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said to Cain, why are you annoyed? This is the Chabad translation. Why are you annoyed? And why has your countenance fallen? Is it not so that if you improve, it will be forgiven you? If you do not improve, however, at the entrance, sin is lying. Sin is lying in wait for you. Sin. It's like an animal crouching at the door. Sin is lying at the entrance, and to you is its longing. So this is like the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, and it longs to seduce you. But ve'ata timshel bo. But you can rule over it. You can conquer your evil inclination. That's how the Hebrew, ve'ata timshel bo, ve'ata, and you, or the va can also be but you, timshel bo, you can do something to it, right? You can overcome it. Now, here's what John Steinbeck wrote. Where'd it go? There's this passage in his book. And one of the characters has looked into the translations of the Torah. And he says, don't you see? The American Standard Translation orders men to triumph over sin, and you call sin ignorance. And the King James translation makes a promise in thou shalt, meaning that men will surely triumph over sin. But the Hebrew word, the word timshel, means thou mayest. And that gives a choice. It might be the most important word in the world that says the way is open. So if we look at some other translations here of Genesis 4:7, right? So sin is crouching at the door, says the King James Bible. Sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. It's a promise. Don't worry about it. If you have the correct belief system, you will overcome sin. It's a promise to you. Or, as it said, the American Standard Version, right? The New American Standard Bible. If you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it, right? You're ordered to master your evil inclination, and if you don't do it, you're out, right? And so that's kind of that fatalism that was driving, I think the boys' names in East of Eden were Adam and Cal, and it was the younger son, or maybe it's the older son, because it's Cain is the older son between Cain and Abel, and he just feels that he's doomed, right? So there's this sense in these other translations into English of the Hebrew that either, it's not in your hands, don't worry, you're going to master it. You don't have to, it's as long as you acquire the correct belief system about God, like what we're telling you in our religion, then you're going to be fine. Or you shall do this, and you better do it. And if you're unable to do it, it's because there's something deeply wrong with you, and it's a different kind of doom that is being unleashed on the person. And if you look, in this BibleHub.com, there's lots of different translations. New King James Version, you should rule over it. NASB 1995, you must master it. Amplified Bible, you must master it. It's like all these different Bibles, and they all, English Revised Version, thou shalt rule over him. But the Jewish Bible, the JPS Tanakh from 1917, the only one included in this, collection of Bible translations, and this is the one that Steinbeck would have been looking at, or something like it, because it says, and unto thee is its desire, sin, which is crouching at the door, unto thee is its desire, but thou mayest rule over it. And that's what Steinbeck picked up on, and it's this idea that the future is not written. It's up to you. Sin will always crouch at the door. You will always be tempted. God knew what was in Cain's heart. Right? What's coming next is terrible. Cain is going to kill his brother Abel in this fit of jealousy. It hasn't happened yet. God could maybe see the future, but he says to Cain, you can rule over it. Thou mayest rule over it. It is in your power to transform yourself and overcome your sinful urge. I've already told you what's right and wrong. I mean, particularly all of us who come after the Ten Commandments were given, God lets us know with a great certainty what is right and wrong, but it's up to us whether we're going to follow that law or not. There is no promise that any individual will overcome his sin. Certainly he's telling us, don't murder, don't steal, don't do the various things that the commandments tell us to do. But there's no certainty about what each of us will do. And yet we are empowered with this knowledge that we can rule over it. Nobody is doomed to remain the person they were when they are ruled by their own evil urge, their inclination, their harmful inclinations. Whether it has to do with substance abuse or being an abuser who abuses other people, being a rotten boss, any personality trait that we're ashamed of, that we know we need to change. Yes, we have the power to transform ourselves and overcome that temptation which is crouching at the door, right? And when the character in East of Eden shares, how the tradition really became corrupted when it was translated into other languages, and say, but look, what the original teaching from God is it's empowering. You have the power. You can do it. Do not be fatalistic about your own personality and your weaknesses. You can overcome them. It's a wonderful moment. I just remember, I've only read that novel once, and I read it more than 30 years ago. And I was so struck by it that I've remembered it ever since. That word timshel. And that is from Genesis 4:7. And I share that with you today because we're going to be coming to the ambiguity in Genesis 4:7 according to our sages. This ambiguity this corruption was introduced when Hebrew was translated into English. But the ambiguity that is inherent in that same verse is not on the word timshel. It's an earlier word in the verse, as we shall see. All right. Where are we? This is Daf Nun Beis. We're on page 52 here in Tractate Yoma. This is the 6th volume of the Talmud. We're studying the laws of Yom Kippur. We're in chapter 5. We're completing our discussion of the 2nd Mishnah in chapter 5, and we'll begin the 3rd Mishnah in chapter 5. Yesterday, we were talking about on Yom Kippur, the high priest, when the temple was standing, when it was time to bring the incense offering into the Holy of Holies, a place that only the high priest could enter and only on the day of Yom Kippur. In order to get there, there was a different path that he took depending on whether we're talking about during the times of the tabernacle, which was built in the wilderness and then stood in Israel for about 400 years, or the first temple, which stood in Jerusalem for about 400 years, or in the times of the second temple, which stood in Jerusalem for about 400 years. And we'll be discussing some of those differences. But the basic thing that we saw, at least in the times of the second temple, which was the closest to the time of the sages and included some of the sages in the late second temple period, is that the high priest would walk through the sanctuary, and there was debate about his route through the sanctuary, whether it was straight or make a curve, etc. Okay, but then there were two curtains that would separate the Holy of Holies from the rest of the sanctuary, and those two curtains were arranged from north to south. And the first curtain that he would encounter ended a little bit short of the southern wall of the sanctuary. He would pass into that space and then walk between the curtains, just 1 cubit wide space between the curtains. And he would walk up that little aisle between the curtains. We talked about it yesterday. Very silent, very quiet, carrying the coal pan, the burning coals in a pan in his right hand, and the super finely ground incense in his left hand. And then he would walk to the north end where there was a gap between the inner curtain and the north wall. And then he would turn in and be in the Holy of Holies and have an encounter with the divine presence. We said yesterday, imagine if we could cultivate that sense of awe whenever we stand for prayer and stand essentially in the divine presence, as the kind of awe that the high priest had as he was approaching the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. All right. The question that's asked at the end of yesterday's page, and that we pick it up with today, is, well, what about that 1 cubit width between the curtains? Is that part of the sanctuary, or is it part of the Holy of Holies? Does it have the sanctity of the Holy of Holies, or does it have the sanctity, but it's a lesser sanctity of the sanctuary? They're not even talking about what the practical difference would be between them, but we can surmise that, well, if it's part of the sanctuary, okay, so then an ordinary priest could go into that 1 cubit space, like between the curtains, and, clean it. He could pass a broom through there. He could walk in there. It would be permitted. Priests can enter the sanctuary. Only the high priest can enter the Holy of Holies, and only on Yom Kippur. We've talked before, there were maintenance men who occasionally had to go in there to fix something, but they would not walk through that space. They would be lowered through the roof in a little box with blinders on so that they couldn't, look at what they're not supposed to see, just do their job and get out of there. So the question is, the 1 cubit that separates the sanctuary from the Holy of Holies, what is its level of sanctity? That of the sanctuary or that of the Holy of Holies? And this is what Rabbi Yochanan said. Yosef of Hutzal raised a dilemma with regard to the verse from first book of Kings, chapter 6, verse 19. And he prepared a partition in the midst of the house within to set there the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. And this was his dilemma that was raised before the sages with regard to what case is the verse speaking. Now, what we're describing here is how Solomon built the first temple. And the Gemara explains the dilemma. Should it be read, and now here, okay, so Hebrew syntax is obviously very different than English syntax. So when we're translating, it's difficult to understand how the ambiguity lies. But basically, because there's no punctuation in Hebrew in the Torah, we're not sure where one sentence ends and the next sentence begins. It could be that a sentence ends and we're starting a new one, or it could be that the sentence is being continued. So there's two ways to read this verse. And he prepared a partition in the midst of the house within to set there the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. And basically, it's the question about this within. Is it connected to the first part, or is the whole thing one verse? Are we going to split the verse or not? Sometimes there's two sentences within a verse when we translate it into more modern language. So it's like this. The Gemara explains the dilemma. Should it be read, and Solomon prepared a partition in the midst of the house within to set there, meaning that he placed the partition within the temple, and behind it, he prepared a space to place the ark. Therefore, the partition itself is the line that denotes this is where the sanctuary ends, and beyond it is the Holy of Holies. In other words, the partition area, that 1 cubit, is part of the sanctuary and not part of the Holy of Holies. So therefore, an ordinary priest could go in between those curtains and clean it up. Or perhaps this is what the verse states: a partition in the midst of the house within, i.e., the verse ends there while the rest of the text forms a new verse. Now, according to this interpretation, the place of the partition itself was part of the Holy of Holies, and that was where Solomon prepared a place for the Ark of the Covenant. So it's just, we cannot, there's no clear indication from the way that verse is written, where the partition is mentioned between the Holy of Holies and the sanctuary. From the way the grammar in Hebrew is structured, we cannot tell if that area, that 1 cubit wide area, is part of the Holy of Holies or of the sanctuary. Now, the Gemara is surprised at this explanation. And was Yosef of Hutzal really uncertain how to punctuate this verse? But wasn't it taught in a Baraisa that Isi ben Yehuda says, there are 5 verses in the Torah whose meaning cannot be decided. In other words, it is unclear from the text how the verses should be read. And what they're saying is there are 5 verses in the Torah where the ambiguity is built in. We could give an opinion on how we think it should be decided, but there's no way that we could ever be sure exactly what is being said there. And that's in 5 locations. And this verse from the book of Kings about the partition and whether it belongs to the Holy of Holies or to the sanctuary is not one of those 5 places. So therefore, it must be that it's not ambiguous. There must be a definitive answer, is what the Gemara is arguing now. By quoting this Baraisa where Isi ben Yehuda says there's only 5 places. What are the 5? The first example is from Genesis 4:7. And here, the word that they say the ambiguity is on is se'et. Se'et. So if we go back to Bereshit 7, Genesis 4:7, right? Is it not so, says God to Cain, is it not so, haloi im tetiv, right? Haloi im tetiv, se'et, or se'es, ve'im lo tetiv, lapechas hata'as rabetz, right? So is it not so that if you improve, it will be forgiven you? This is the way Chabad translation is. Is it not so that if you improve, it will be forgiven you? If you do not improve, however, sin croucheth at the door. Its longing is for you, but you can rule over it. Thou mayest rule over it. The ambiguity is on the word se'es, or se'et, in a more Israeli pronunciation. And this word se'es, what does it mean? Technically, what it means is lifted up. So God is saying to Cain, right, why are you annoyed? Why has your countenance fallen? Why do you look so upset? Is it not true that if you improve, if you better yourself, if you bring me a better gift next time, right? Remember, Abel's offering was accepted, Cain's was not. Now, the Torah, the way it says it here, right? Abel brought from the fattest of the flock. Cain brought a gift of the fruit of the ground. So maybe God was saying that Abel, put a little more love into the present than Cain did. But Cain became jealous and upset. My brother's gift was accepted and mine wasn't. Who does my brother think he is? Right? And ends up killing Abel. But before he kills his brother, when he's just upset that his gift was not accepted, God says to him, isn't it so that if you better yourself, if you improve, se'es, it will be lifted up. Now, usually, that's what it means. It will be lifted up. So does it mean if you better yourself, right, the mistakes you've already made will be lifted up. They will no longer be a burden to you. In fact, elsewhere in the Talmud, we learn that when a person makes a true atonement, his past sins not only get erased from the ledger, they get turned into merits. Like somebody who's committed a lot of sins in the past, if they're able to make a true atonement and a transformation into a good person, then their sins don't just get erased, they get transformed into merits. Like it says, if he committed all these good deeds, the sins become good deeds on the ledger for a person, since all of our deeds are accounted for, both good and bad. Is it not so that if you improve, se'es, it will be lifted up, normally translated as, it will be forgiven you. If you do not improve, however, at the entrance, sin is lying. So the way it could be read is it not so that if you improve, it's implied that something good will happen. But se'es, if you do not improve, you always have a choice to do better. But if you do not change your ways, then your sins will be lifted up, and not in a positive way. In other words, in se'es could mean, if it's attached to the first part, if you improve, se'es, it will be lifted up as if it will be forgiven to you what you did in the past. But if it will be lifted up, if you do not improve, it's connected to the next part, right? Why is your countenance fallen? Is it not so that if you improve, then it's good, and now it could be a new thought, it will be lifted up if you do not improve, meaning your sins will come with you. If you do not change your ways, then all of your sins will remain with you, and when you go to the world to come, you'll carry all those sins with you. They will not have been turned into merits, or the way Rav Steinsaltz puts it, the first example is the term se'es. It is unclear whether the verse should be read, if you do well, shall it not be lifted up? In which case, se'es involves forgiveness and pardon. Or, if you do well, but you will lift up your sin if you do not do well. According to this interpretation, se'es, lifting up, is referring to remembrance. If you do not do well, your sin will be remembered, right? And so what does se'es mean? Does it mean you'll be forgiven, or does it mean your sins will be remembered? We can't be sure. This is one of the 5 places where there's an ambiguity in the Torah. The second uncertain case is the term meshukadim from Exodus 25:34. This is a description of the menorah, that menorah that's standing in the sanctuary that the high priest walks by on his way to the Holy of Holies. About the menorah, the verse can be read, and in the candelabrum, the menorah, 4 cups made like almond blossoms, that's this word, meshukadim, almond blossoms, or it can be read, its knobs and its flowers made like almond blossoms. In other words, the term meshukadim, almond blossoms, can be read either with the first part or the last part of the verse. What is shaped like almond blossoms? Is it the cups of the menorah, or is it the knobs within the stem of the menorah? The third case, the term machar in Exodus 17:9. This is where God is saying, or I guess Moses is saying to the people, tomorrow you're going to go out and fight Amalek. Well, he's saying to Joshua, take a troop and fight Amalek, right? Amalek, we have to go to war with Amalek. Because this is that vicious tribe that, as we were coming out of Egypt and everyone saw the miracles that God performed for us, Amalek said, yeah, but let's see if we could show that they're not invincible. And what did Amalek do? He didn't go to war with the men of Israel. He just, he sent a troop of people to the back of the line, where the old people and the young children were, walking the slowest at the end of the procession out of Egypt, and just killed a few of the weakest members of the Jewish people. This is one of the reasons we have a terrible disregard for Amalek, and God says you shall wipe the people and the name of Amalek out of this world. Don't forget to wipe out Amalek. Right? But at the time that they have a war with Amalek, what does he say? Moses says, and go out, fight with Amalek mahar, tomorrow. Go out and have a war with Amalek tomorrow. Go fight Amalek tomorrow. Or it can mean that Joshua must go out to war with Amalek immediately, and Moses added, mahar, I will stand on the top of the hill. Right? So the verse in its entirety is, right, and go out and fight with Amalek tomorrow, I will stand on top of the hill. So is he saying, tomorrow, you'll go out to war and I will stand on top of the hill? Or is he saying, you go out to war today, you don't need my help. Tomorrow, you're going to need my help and I will stand on the hill. And this is the incident where, they're holding up Moses' arms. And when his arms are up, the army is succeeding. And when he gets tired and his arms droop, the army starts to be defeated a little bit by Amalek. But the question about this tomorrow, does it mean everything's going to happen tomorrow, or you go out and fight today, I will do my prophet part tomorrow? The fourth case is the term arur. This is Genesis 49:7, and this verse can be read, cursed, arur, be their anger, for it was fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel. Now this is when Jacob is giving blessings to his 12 sons at his deathbed. And it seems that he's recalling the incident of Shechem in chapter 34. This is when Dinah, it seems, was raped by the prince of Shechem. And then he wanted to marry her. And it's a long, complicated story. That was also a big deal for me when I encountered that story in college. I've told that story before. But for our purposes here, Shimon and Levi go out and basically kill all the men of the town of Shechem, and then they take all the women and children as slaves, and they leave a ghost town. And Jacob and none of the family liked it that their daughter was raped. But Jacob also didn't like that all of the men of the town were slaughtered in a kind of act of vengeance. And there's different opinions about, was this an evil town like Sodom and Gomorrah, where it had become so lawless that the death penalty was warranted, or was it that Shimon and Levi were just wrong? They were way too hot-headed and angry, and Jacob was furious with them and what he did, and he remembered the incident many years later on his deathbed, and he says, "Cursed be their anger, for it was fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel." He doesn't curse his sons, Shimon and Levi, but he curses their anger on his deathbed. Or this term, cursed, which appears at the beginning of the verse, can be read as the last word of the previous verse, Genesis 49:6. "And in their anger, they cut off cursed oxen." According to this interpretation, cursed oxen is referring to the oxen of Shechem who descended from the accursed Canaan, essentially saying that whole town was cursed, right? I mean, even to its animals, it was cursed. They were descended, from an evil ancestor, and, let's face it, it needed to be done type of thing, which would seem to negate cursing his son's anger. Most, like the way that the Torah has come to be vowelized and punctuated is that he curses his son's anger, but there is room for that ambiguity. And finally, the fifth case, the term vekam in Deuteronomy 31:6. This is very late in the Torah, and God is talking to Moses and saying, you're not going to enter the promised land. You've done a great job. Right? You've done a fantastic job. You led the children of Israel out of Egypt. You led them through the wilderness for 40 years. They were punished because of the sin of the spies, which we talked about earlier this week. And that's why that generation has to perish in the wilderness. It's their children who will enter the promised land. Moses didn't do anything wrong. He didn't panic and say that we'll never be able to enter the promised land. Joshua and Caleb are going to be allowed to enter the promised land. Nobody else. Why not Moses? Moses did such a good job, and his longing was to enter the promised land. But God, points out that he didn't sanctify God's name in the incident of, striking the rock to make a fountain of water. We're not going to be discussing that right now. But in this verse, it can be read as Deuteronomy 31:16, "Behold, you are about to sleep with your fathers, vekam. This people will rise up and go astray." So it can be read, "Behold, you are about to sleep with your fathers and rise up." Meaning, you're now going to die, but don't worry, it's not forever. You will die in this world, and then you will rise up. Either because your soul is going to continue in the world of souls, or more likely what it means in this situation is your body's going to die here now, and you'll sleep with your fathers, but your soul will be restored to your body, right, in the resurrection of the dead that will come at the beginning of the Messianic age, right? When when this world enters the Messianic age, your soul and your body will be reunited, and you will be Moses again in this world, in the physical, earthly world. Or does vekam, rise up, connect to the next verse, which is, "Behold, you are about to sleep with your fathers, and rise up will this people and go astray." Once they don't have you as their leader, forget about it. They are going to go astray. They're going to go, chase the gods of other people. They're going to sin. They're going to be in the promised land for some time, and we actually managed to stay there for 1,200 years. But finally, that second temple would be destroyed, and we would enter that long, long exile. And God is telling Moses that this people will rise up and go astray. Right? So is the rise up connected to Moses dying and then rising up, or is the rise up connected to this after Moses dies, this people will go astray? No way to know for sure. Those are the 5 places of ambiguity in the Torah, built-in ambiguity. Now, the Gemara explains the objection presented by this Baraisa. And wasn't it taught in a Baraisa that Yosef of Hutzal is the one called Yosef the Babylonian, as Hutzal is a city in Babylonia? And he is also the person called Issi ben Yehuda, the one who brings up that there's 5 ambiguities in the Torah. As Issi is a shortened form of Yosef. He is Issi ben Gur Arya, a nickname for Yehuda. He is Issi ben Gamliel. He is Issi ben Machalel. And what is his real name? Issi ben Akiva is his name. So if they are indeed the same person with all these different names, Issi ben Yehuda, who is Yosef of Hutzal, and he says that there's only 5 verses whose punctuation is unclear, whereas he adds an additional verse. Here he's saying that in terms of the 1 cubit width between the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies, and we can't be sure whether it attaches, we can't be sure the punctuation of that verse, whether the Holy of, that 1 strip, 1 cubit wide strip is connected to the Holy of Holies or to the sanctuary, depending on how we punctuate that verse in the first book of Kings. Well, he himself said there's only 5 places of ambiguity, so that must not be a place of ambiguity. And then the Gemara answers, there's 5 places in the Torah, 5 places in the 5 books of Moses. But there are additional ambiguities in the books of the prophets and in the books of the writings. So there's no reason why there can't also be an ambiguity about that. And at the end of the day, that finishes our discussion of the second Mishnah here in chapter 5. And we didn't learn, is that 1 cubit wide strip part of the Holy of Holies or of the sanctuary? Now, we're late in the day. So I'm going to read the third Mishnah and just start a little bit of the commentary on it. And then I'll come to your questions and comments. And then we're going to a big celebration tonight because our daughter is graduating from high school. So we're not going to have a whole lot of time for discussion. So let me keep it moving. The outer curtain between the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies was hooked. Parufa, slightly open on the south side of the sanctuary, and the inner curtain hooked slightly open on the north side, like we talked about. Right? He's gonna encounter 2 curtains. One ends a little short. The front curtain ends a little short of the south side of the sanctuary. Then he goes between the curtains, and then the inner curtain ends a little short of the north side, the north wall of the sanctuary, and that's how he'll pass into the Holy of Holies. Right, and therefore, okay. And therefore, the high priest could not. Yeah, I'm almost done. And therefore, the high priest could not enter. Where am I? The Holy of Holies directly. Rather, he enters through the southern opening and walks between the curtains until he reaches the opening to the north. When he reaches the opening to the north, he enters the Holy of Holies through that opening, turns his face to the south, and walks to his left along the curtain until he reaches the area before the ark. And when he reaches the ark, he places the coal pan between the 2 staves, and he piles the incense atop the coals, and the whole chamber in the entirety would fill with smoke, and he then exits and comes out the way that he entered. And he does not turn around, but leaves the Holy of Holies, walking while facing the ark, and he recites a brief prayer in the outer chamber in the sanctuary, and he would not extend his prayer there so as not to alarm the Jewish people who would otherwise conclude that something happened and that he died in the Holy of Holies. So I just got the signal that we really need to get up and go to that celebration at the high school. So that's the Mishnah. That's the third Mishnah. And we'll continue tomorrow with our discussion of that Mishnah, which is fascinating. I'm not going to be able to take questions and comments because I got to go. Have a great night, my holy sisters and brothers. I haven't signed off yet.